For Lucius Valerius Aquila, crucifixion was a craft. He had his rituals, his familiar movements, a sequence of actions practiced to the point of automation that allowed him to wall himself off from the event. The hill the locals called Golgotha was just another workplace. A sun-scorched Judean mound that stank of sweat, fear, and the cheap, sour wine the legionaries drank to dull their senses. There were 3 on the hill today, 2 robbers and 1 other, a preacher from Galilee, whose name had been buzzing all over Jerusalem for the last few days. Lucius didn't concern himself with the details. To him, this was just another condemned man, another order from the prefect, another body to be nailed to a tree and left to die. "Pull harder, Gaius!" he roared at the young legionary, who was struggling to hold the rope tied to the condemned man's left arm. "Or do you want him to break free and botch the whole job?" Gaius, a blond youth from Campania whose beard had barely begun to grow, dug his sandal into the earth and pulled harder. The muscles on the condemned man's arm bulged, his skin stretched white. The centurion, Cassius, who was observing the process with a stone-faced expression, gave a nod. It was the signal. Lucius raised the hammer. Heavy and balanced, it settled comfortably into his calloused palm. He didn't look at the face of the man on the cross. He never looked. It was one of the main rules he had set for himself over 10 years of service in the 10th Legion. You remember faces. Faces appear in your dreams. And he needed to sleep soundly. The legionary's gaze was fixed on the wrist, on the point where the nail had to go, between the bones so the body's weight wouldn't tear the flesh. Quick, efficient, one precise strike. He swung the hammer. The air was thick with heat and unspoken tension. The crowd below hummed like a disturbed beehive. Some shouted curses, others wept. To Lucius, it was all just background noise, the soundtrack to his work. And at that moment, just as the iron began its descent, the man on the cross spoke. His voice was not a cry of pain or rage, the kind Lucius had heard hundreds of times. The condemned man did not curse his executioners or beg for mercy. His voice was hoarse with thirst but surprisingly clear and firm. It wasn't addressed to them, nor to the crowd, but somewhere upward, toward the merciless, faded sky. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The hammer froze an inch from the wrist. For Lucius, the world stopped. The noise of the crowd vanished. The sound of Gaius's strained breathing fell silent. All that remained were those words, which had pierced his consciousness like a pilum through a leather shield. Forgive them. It was impossible. Absurd. It went against every law of human nature Lucius knew. When a man is stripped of everything, dignity, freedom, life itself, all he has left is hatred. He had seen it in the eyes of hundreds he had led to their deaths. Their gazes were filled with venom, with promises of vengeance in another life. They spat in the faces of the legionaries, hurled curses at Rome, at the emperor, at the gods. And that was right. That was understandable. But forgiveness? For this? For the nails? For the crown of thorns digging into his scalp? For the humiliation and agonizing death? Lucius, what demon are you waiting for? Centurion Cassius barked, tearing him from his stupor. Lucius blinked. Reality returned with a deafening roar. He struck with all his might. The nail sank into flesh with a sickening crunch, shattering bone. The condemned man's whole body shuddered, but only a muffled groan escaped his lips, not a scream. Then came the second hand. The feet. The work was done. The 3 crosses were slowly raised to a vertical position and set into pre-dug holes. The job was finished. Now all that was left was to wait for the sun and suffocation to do their work. The legionaries moved into the shadow of a rock to cast lots, dice, for the preacher's clothes. This too was part of the ritual. But Lucius couldn't participate. He stood apart, his gaze drawn against his will to the central cross. For the first time, he truly looked at the face. It was battered, covered in blood and dust, but calm. There was no hatred in the eyes, only an immense weariness and something else Lucius couldn't comprehend. A kind of cosmic sorrow. The words echoed in his skull. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Know not! He sneered inwardly, a bitter thought. He knew perfectly well. He knew how to drive a nail correctly. He knew how long it would take for a man to suffocate under the weight of his own body. He knew the kind of scream a woman would make upon seeing her son in such a state. He was a master of this trade. He knew everything. And this Galilean was asking for his forgiveness? The hours dragged on like molten lead. The sky darkened, though it was still far from sunset. A wind rose, howling between the rocks. The crowd thinned. Only the most steadfast remained. A few weeping women at the foot of the cross, and the same disciple Lucius had seen with the preacher in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before. Lucius felt something inside him crack. Something he had spent years building around his heart. A wall of cynicism, discipline, and indifference. Guilt was an old coin for him, worn smooth from frequent use. But the crucified man's words seemed to have minted it anew, restoring its weight and sharp edges. Suddenly, other faces flashed before his mind's eye. Faint, forgotten shadows from the past. A zealot with burning eyes whom he had crucified at the Jaffa Gate 2 years ago. An old farmer who refused to pay his taxes and was executed as a warning. 2 runaway slaves caught on the road to Jericho. They hadn't asked for forgiveness for their killers. They had screamed, and he, Lucius, had silenced them. Hundreds, maybe more. He had never kept count. It was just a job, an order, service to Rome. But when the last breath came from the cross and the earth trembled beneath his feet, Lucius knew that this execution was different. It didn't end with the death of the condemned. For him, Lucius Valerius Aquila, it had just begun. The wall had crumbled, and beneath its rubble, for the first time in years, he felt something other than weariness and irritation. He felt the horror of what he had done. And that horror had a name, his own. The following days blurred into a murky, gray haze for Lucius. Jerusalem, rid of the pilgrims after Passover, was returning to its usual life, simmering with hidden hatred. For the legionaries, this meant a return to routine. Patrolling the narrow, stinking streets, standing guard on the walls of the Antonia fortress, drilling under the merciless sun. For Lucius, this had always been a salvation. The clear rhythm of service, the weight of his armor, the straightforward commands, it all helped to keep his thoughts in check. But now the ritual had failed. Sleep became his enemy. As soon as he closed his eyes, the bloodied face from the cross would appear before him, and the words he so desperately tried to forget would ring in his ears with deafening clarity. "Father, forgive them." He would wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the stuffy barracks, to the snores and murmurs of other soldiers, and feel an icy dread spread through his heart. Wine didn't help. It only dulled his senses for an hour or two before the nightmares returned with new force, now accompanied by a nauseating headache. He grew silent and grim, avoiding the usual barak room jokes and games of dice. His comrades, noticing the change, at first tried to cheer him up, but after hitting a wall of alienation, they shrugged and left him alone. Everyone in Judea had their own demons. On the 3rd day after the execution, unable to bear the solitude any longer, he sought out Gaius, the young legionary who had helped him on Golgotha. The boy was cleaning his scutum shield by a cistern in the courtyard. "Remember that day? On the hill?" Lucius began, trying to make his voice sound as casual as possible. The ground shook then. Strange that. Gaius flinched, nearly dropping his oiled rag. He shot Lucius a quick, frightened glance. "Just an earthquake, Lucius. It happens in these parts. And the sky? Just a storm rolling in. Nothing special." "You think so?" Lucius looked him straight in the eye. "And the words of that man? Did you hear them?" The young man's face turned pale. "I try not to listen to their ravings. He was a criminal. We were ordered, we obeyed. That's it. No need to fill your head with nonsense. The centurion doesn't like it when soldiers think too much." Gaius hastily finished his cleaning and, muttering an excuse, hurried away. Lucius realized the boy was terrified. He too had heard and seen everything but had chosen the easiest path, to forget. Path Lucius could no longer find. Gaius's answer didn't satisfy him. He needed to talk to someone who wasn't afraid to face the truth, even if it was ugly. And that man could only be Centurion Cassius. He found him on the training ground, watching recruits practice their strikes on wooden posts. Cassius, a veteran of the Germanic wars, was a man made of granite. His scarred face expressed nothing but eternal weariness and contempt for anything not related to discipline and war. "Centurion," Lucius said, snapping to attention. Cassius slowly turned his head. His gray, drill-like eyes bored into Lucius. "What is it? Aquila? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I wanted to ask about the execution of that preacher." The words came with difficulty. "There are strange rumors going around." The corner of Cassius's mouth twitched in a contemptuous sneer. "Rumors. All they do in this city is breed rumors. If you listen to every spice merchant and every mourner, you'll go mad." "What rumors this time?" "They say his tomb is empty." Cassius grunted and turned back to the recruits. "The official report says his disciples stole the body during the night while the guards were asleep. The chief priests paid a handsome sum to make that the only story. And the soldiers from that guard detail. Let's just say they received a generous severance and advice to get out of Judea as quickly as possible. Useful advice if you want to stay alive. But could legionaries fall asleep on duty?" Lucius questioned. "That's a certain death sentence. Money works wonders, Aquila." Cassius cut him off, not turning around. "Especially in this cursed province. Remember one thing, there was a man named Yeshua. He caused trouble. Rome executed him. End of story. Everything else is the ravings of hysterical women and fanatics. Don't let local superstitions soften your brain. You are a soldier of Rome, not a Judean mystic. Return to your duties." The conversation was over. But Cassius's explanation, so simple and logical, brought Lucius no relief. On the contrary, it sowed even more doubt. Stole the body? Why? To create a myth about resurrection? It seemed too complex and dangerous a plan for a handful of terrified fishermen who had scattered at the first sight of the guards in Gethsemane. That same evening, while patrolling the market square near the Damascus Gate, he witnessed a strange scene. A few people, huddled together in the shadow of an archway, were whispering excitedly. Their faces were a mixture of fear and ecstasy. Lucius deliberately led his patrol closer, pretending to check for order. As they passed, fragments of phrases reached him. Peter saw him himself, by the lake. And Mary, she spoke with him at the tomb. He is alive. The Lord is risen indeed. Lucius's heart skipped a beat. He stopped abruptly. The people fell silent in fear and quickly melted into the crowd. But their words had already seeped into his mind like poison. He is alive. It was madness. Utter, absolute madness. The dead do not return. Lucius himself had driven the nails. He had seen another legionary spear enter the man's side. He had seen the blood and water. He was certain the man was dead. And yet, was a man who asked heaven for his executioner's forgiveness an ordinary man? Lucius stood in the middle of the bustling square, but heard neither the shouts of merchants nor the bleating of sheep. He was alone with an impossible, monstrous thought. The centurion's explanation was a lie, designed to maintain order. The people's explanation was madness, born of grief. But somewhere between the lie and the madness, there had to be the truth. And he, Lucius Valerius Aquila, the executioner of the Nazarene, suddenly understood with terrifying clarity that he could not go on living until he found it. He had to find out what really happened at that tomb. He had to find one of these people and make them talk. The obsession to find the Nazarene's followers became a fever for Lucius. By day, he was a model legionary. His armor gleamed, his sword was sharp, and orders were executed with mechanical precision. But it was only a mask. His real life began after sunset. He traded a Syrian merchant for a simple tunic of coarse wool and a worn, hooded cloak, attire that allowed him to dissolve into the diverse crowd of the lower city. Taking off the symbols of a legionary, the caligy, the gladius, the pugio dagger, he felt strangely vulnerable, naked. But this vulnerability was necessary. A Roman soldier asking about the followers of an executed rebel would arouse immediate suspicion from both the Jews and his own superiors. For the first few nights, his search was fruitless. He roamed the labyrinth of narrow streets where the air was thick with the smells of spices, sewage, and fried fish. He listened to conversations in taverns, studied the faces of people sitting around communal fires, trying to catch that familiar shade of fear and elation he had seen on the faces near the Damascus Gate. But he was met with a solid wall of mistrust. To the locals, he was an outsider even in civilian clothes. His posture, his bearing, his short-cropped hair, everything betrayed him as a soldier. His questions were either ignored or met with shrugs and mumbles of ignorance. He understood their fear. The Nazarenes' followers were outlaws. The Sanhedrin considered them a dangerous sect, and to the Roman authorities, they were potential insurgents rallying around a dead leader. Anyone who dared to speak with him risked everything. On the fourth night, he changed his tactics. Instead of asking, he began to watch. He targeted a neighborhood near the Pool of Siloam, where the poor mostly lived, fishermen, artisans, beggars. He reasoned that it was among such people that the preacher from Galilee had found the most supporters. He found an inconspicuous spot on the roof of an abandoned warehouse, which offered a view of a small courtyard surrounded by several mud-brick houses. For hours, he lay there, motionless like a lizard on a rock, blending in with the night shadows. He watched as oil lamps were lit and extinguished, as people returned home, as the sounds of the city died down, giving way to the barking of dogs and the cries of night birds. His patience was rewarded. He noticed people entering one of the houses with a peculiar caution. They approached not in groups, but one by one or in pairs, looking around before slipping through a dark doorway. They were simple people. A man with the calloused hands of a carpenter, a woman carrying a jug, a young man whose face seemed vaguely familiar to Lucius. He held his breath. A faint light shone through a crack in the house's shuttered window. He couldn't hear anything, but he felt he had found what he was looking for. He remained at his post late into the night until the people began to leave just as quietly. Among the last to emerge, he recognized him. It was the same young disciple who had stood at the foot of the cross next to Yeshua's mother, the one whose face had been contorted with silent grief. But now, there was no trace of despair on his face. In the moonlight, Lucius saw an expression of peace and a quiet, confident joy. This discrepancy shook Lucius to his core. A man who had witnessed the agonizing death of his teacher should not look like this. He should be broken, crushed, hiding in fear. But this young man walked through the night street as if he carried within him the greatest secret and the greatest treasure. Lucius did not follow him. He was too agitated. He had found them. Now came the hardest and most dangerous part. Approaching them. How could he do it? Burst in with a sword? Pointless. They would just fall silent. Try to talk to them? They wouldn't believe a word he said. He returned to the Antonia fortress just before dawn, as the eastern sky began to lighten. Slipping into the barracks, he lay on his bunk but did not close his eyes. A plan was forming in his mind. Desperate, risky, perhaps insane. He could not come to them as Lucius Aquila, legionary, executioner, and murderer. But perhaps he could come to them as someone else? As a man also seeking answers. As a broken sinner seeking forgiveness. The irony of the thought seared him. To find the truth about the forgiveness offered to him from the cross, he would have to lie. The lie required preparation. Simply changing clothes wasn't enough. He had to change his identity. Lucius spent the next 2 days crafting his new persona. He stopped shaving, letting a coarse, dark stubble cover his cheeks and chin. He deliberately stained his tunic with dust and soot to look like a man with nowhere to go. But the hardest part was the story. He decided to call himself Quintus, a cattle merchant from Samaria. Samaritans were despised by the Jews, which made him an outcast by definition. This could explain his solitude. The legend was simple. He had cheated, inflated prices, and ruined the poor. His sins were material, understandable, and most importantly, far from bloodshed. He rehearsed his story, whispering it during his night watches on the tower walls, until he could recite it flawlessly, with the right measure of shame and despair in his voice. He learned to look at the ground, to slouch, to hide his confident legionary's gaze under a mask of humility. The next night, he returned to his observation post on the roof. He waited. When the young disciple, whom he now knew by the name of John, was the last to leave the house, Lucius slipped down like a shadow and followed him at a safe distance. He did not attack from the darkness. That would have been a mistake. He waited until John entered a small square illuminated by the moon, and then he called out, "Master!" His voice sounded hoarse and uncertain, exactly as he had intended. John spun around, his hand instinctively going to his belt where a knife might have been. Seeing only a shabby, down-and-out man before him, he relaxed slightly, but his gaze remained wary. "What do you want?" he asked. His Aramaic had a soft Galilean accent. Lucius slowly approached, keeping his hands in sight. He bowed his head low. "Forgive my intrusion. My name is Quintus. I heard talk in the city. About your teacher. About what he said. About forgiveness." At the word teacher, John tensed even more. "Who sent you? The temple guard? The Romans?" "No one. I swear by all the gods I have betrayed." Lucius's voice broke, and he was surprised at how genuine it sounded. The despair he was feigning was merely a reflection of his own real despair. I am a man with a heavy burden on my soul. I have done many wicked things. I have cheated people, taken the last from widows and orphans. My life is a web of lies and greed, and now this burden is crushing me to the ground. I heard that Yeshua of Nazareth said that even for someone like me, there is hope. Is it true? He raised his eyes to John. He poured into that gaze all his pain, all his sleepless anguish, all the guilt that gnawed at him from within. He wasn't lying about his feelings. He was only substituting their cause. John was silent for a long time, studying his face. Lucius felt as if he were being interrogated. This youth, almost a boy, possessed a gaze of astonishing depth and insight. He seemed to see not the dirt and stubble on his face, but his very soul. "Why are you looking for us?" John finally asked, his voice softer. "It is dangerous, for you and for us, because there is nowhere else to go," Lucius breathed out. "I went to the synagogue, but their law only lists my sins and promises punishment. I tried to offer sacrifices, but it did not ease my soul. I heard your teacher spoke not of a law of stone, but a law of the heart. I want to know if there is forgiveness for someone like me, or am I cursed forever?" The last words tore from his lips almost as a cry. He hadn't expected such force himself. The wall he had been building cracked again. John saw it. Compassion flickered in his eyes, replacing suspicion. He saw before him not a spy, but a broken man. The teacher said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," he said quietly. He did not push away tax collectors or prostitutes. He ate with them at the same table. Lucius's heart began to beat so hard it felt ready to break through his ribs. "So, there is hope? There is always hope as long as a person breathes," John replied. A faint, sad smile appeared on his face. "Come to this same house in 2 days after sunset. Knock 3 times like this." He lightly tapped his knuckles on his palm. "The door will be opened for you. Come with peace in your heart, and listen." With that, John nodded and walked away quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. Lucius was left alone in the empty square. The air felt cold and thin. He had done it. He had deceived them. The door he had so desperately sought was now ajar. But by entering it, he would become a wolf in sheep's clothing, defiling the very place where he hoped to find healing with his presence. The weight of his true sin, of murder, became even more unbearable under the burden of this new lie. He had gotten what he wanted, but the price was higher than he had ever imagined. The 2 days of waiting became a form of torture for Lucius, far more refined than any drill on the training field under the blazing sun. The lie he had created became his prison. Every morning, as he put on his armor, he felt like a double imposter. First, he hid his soul from his fellow soldiers, and now he was preparing to hide his true face from the very people from whom he sought salvation. At night, he was tormented not only by images of the crucifixion but also by John's gaze. A trusting, compassionate gaze he had bought with deceit. Several times, he was on the verge of abandoning his plan, of returning to the familiar emptiness of service where the guilt was at least honest. But the voice from the cross continued to echo in his memory, and he knew there was no turning back. On the appointed evening, as the last rays of sun painted the walls of Jerusalem the color of blood and gold, Lucius, dressed in the rags of Quintus, made his way to the house by the pool of Siloam. Each step echoed like a drumbeat in his soul. He was a soldier on the most dangerous mission of his life, where the enemy was his own past, and the battlefield was the fragile trust of a handful of outcasts. He approached the nondescript wooden door and froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a siege ram. He raised his hand and knocked uncertainly 3 times, just as John had taught him. For a moment, there was silence, and he thought he had been tricked, that guards or an empty room awaited him behind the door. But then he heard the creak of a bolt, and the door opened a crack. An elderly man with a gray beard and kind, weary eyes stood on the threshold. He silently looked Lucius up and down, then nodded and gestured for him to enter. Lucius stepped across the threshold and into another world. The smell of the dusty streets was replaced by the aroma of burning oil, baked bread, and something elusively human, the warmth of many bodies in a small space. The room was simple, almost bare. A few mats on the packed earth floor, a low table in the center. But it was full of people. 24 men and women sat huddled together. Their faces, illuminated by the flickering light of a few oil lamps, were diverse, young and old, rough from labor and refined. But in all their eyes, Lucius saw the same thing: a quiet, focused hope. He felt like an intruder, a wolf that had wandered into a sheep pasture. All eyes turned to him for a moment, and he instinctively tensed, expecting questions, suspicion, hostility. But no one said anything. John, sitting by the table, simply gave him an encouraging smile and pointed to an empty space by the wall. Lucius slipped over and sat down, trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. The gathering began without any formal ritual. A sturdy, broad-shouldered man with the weathered face of a fisherman began to speak. His voice was loud, accustomed to shouting over the roar of waves, but now it sounded surprisingly gentle. This was Simon, whom the teacher had named Peter. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his gaze sweeping over everyone. "Fear still dwells in our hearts. We hide behind locked doors, like sheep when a wolf is near. But I want to remind you not of fear, but of his promise. On that night when I was weak," his voice wavered, and he looked down. "On that night when I denied him 3 times, I thought it was all over for me, that I had betrayed not just the teacher, but myself, my very soul. I wept bitterly, and my guilt was like a stone dragging me to the bottom of the Sea of Galilee." Lucius held his breath. Peter's words were not a sermon but a confession, and they pierced his own soul like red-hot needles. "But then he appeared to us on the shore," Peter continued, his voice growing strong again, ringing with a restrained miracle. "He did not rebuke me. He did not cast me out. His gaze was not filled with punishment, but with work for me to do. He asked, 'Simon, do you love me?' And I, the betrayer, could only whisper, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' And he forgave me. He didn't just erase my sin. He gave me a commission to feed his lambs." Peter fell silent, and in the quiet that followed, someone could be heard sobbing. Lucius sat as still as a statue. He, the murderer, was listening to the confession of a betrayer who had been granted forgiveness. A forgiveness that not only freed from guilt but also gave new purpose. It was incomprehensible to his Roman mind, accustomed to a clear system: crime and punishment, valor and reward. Here everything was turned inside out. The greatest fall became the beginning of the greatest service. Then John took a loaf of unleavened bread from the table. He lifted it, said a short prayer of thanks, then broke it and began passing the pieces around. When the bread reached Lucius, he froze for a moment. His hands, which had held the hammer and nails, were now supposed to accept this symbol of what? He didn't know, but he saw the reverence with which the others received it. He took his piece. The bread was warm, real. Then a cup of diluted wine was passed around in the same way. Lucius took a sip. The wine was tart, ordinary, but in this quiet room, among these people, it seemed like something more. He was a participant in a mystery whose meaning he did not understand, but whose power he felt in every part of his tormented being. He looked at the faces. He recognized the woman who had stood by the cross, Mary from Magdala. Her face, which he remembered as being contorted by unbearable grief, was now serene. Her eyes held no madness of sorrow, only a deep, luminous sadness and an unshakable certainty. How could one go through that and sit here with such a face? When the meeting came to an end and people began to quietly disperse, Lucius remained seated, unable to move. He had come here as a spy to uncover the secret of the resurrection. But what he found was far more complex and troubling. He had found a community built not on the myth of an empty tomb, but on the living experience of forgiveness. Their strength was not in evidence, but in transformation. They were broken people who had been made whole. John came and sat beside him. "What troubles your soul, Quintus?" Lucius looked up at him. The mask of the repentant Samaritan now seemed ridiculous and sacrilegious. He wanted to confess, to scream the truth, to tear off this lie, even if it cost him his life. But the words stuck in his throat. Fear and shame paralyzed his tongue. I am not worthy to be here," he croaked, and it was the purest truth he had spoken in days. John placed a hand on his shoulder. His touch was light, but Lucius felt it like a brand. "None of us are worthy," the young man said softly. "That is the whole point. We do not earn this gift. We simply accept it. Come again. The door is open for you." Lucius nodded silently, got up, and walked out into the cool night. He wandered through the deserted streets, not knowing where he was going. He had sought facts and found faith. He had sought an explanation for a miracle and encountered the miracle of forgiveness. And now he was more lost than ever. His lie stood between him and the only source of water in the desert of his soul. And he didn't know how to break down that wall without being crushed by its rubble. Returning to the Antonia fortress after the secret gathering was, for Lucius, like plunging from a warm, clear spring into a foul swamp. The sounds, the smells, the very atmosphere of the barracks had become physically unbearable to him. The weapon grease smelled of death. The coarse laughter of soldiers playing dice echoed in his ears like blasphemy. The hard leather bunk felt like a torture rack. He was living in two worlds, and the line between them had thinned to a sword's edge, on which he walked every minute. By day he was Lucius Aquila, a cog in Rome's military machine. His body, honed by years of training, moved flawlessly. He marched under the scorching sun, practiced with his gladius, stood guard, looking out over the city from the high walls, and felt his soul slowly dying. Every order he followed felt like a betrayal of the world that had been revealed to him in the small house by the pool. One day, his patrol was sent to maintain order at the market, where a tax collector was seizing the last possessions of a potter's family who had fallen into debt. Lucius watched as a thin woman clung to the clay pots, the only thing they had, while her children cried, hiding behind her skirt. Centurion Cassius, leading the unit, sat on his horse with an impassive face. His job was not to dispense justice but to ensure the unquestioning enforcement of the law, no matter how cruel. Lucius and his comrades formed a ring around the stall, pushing back sympathetic neighbors while the tax collector's men carried out the goods. He stood clutching his pilum, his gaze fixed on nothing, but in his mind's eye, he saw the scene from the quiet room. Peter speaking of forgiveness, John breaking the bread. There they shared their last. Here he was helping to take the last. "Good work, Aquila." Cassius threw at him when it was over. "No disturbances. You're getting harder. That's good. This land softens men." Lucius merely nodded, feeling bile rise in his throat. Harder? No, he was falling apart. At night, he became Quintus, the repentant Samaritan. He went to the gatherings again and again, drawn by an irresistible force. He listened greedily. He listened to stories of how Yeshua had healed lepers with a single touch, fed thousands with a few loaves of bread, and taught to love one's enemies and pray for those who curse you. Every word was both a balm and salt on his wound. A balm because it spoke of a world he had never known. Salt because it reminded him of who he was, an enemy, a curser, one of those who had killed the source of these words. He spoke little. His silence and the perpetual sorrow on his face were taken by the others as a sign of deep repentance for his merchant sins. They treated him with quiet sympathy. The old man who had opened the door for him the first time, his name was Barnabas, would sometimes sit next to him and simply place his warm, wrinkled hand on his shoulder. There was more humanity in that simple gesture than in anything Lucius had experienced in 10 years of service in the Legion. The women especially moved him. Mary of Magdala, whose devotion to the teacher was almost tangible. Susanna, Joanna, Salome, they didn't debate theology. They simply served one another. They brought food, cared for the sick, and comforted the weeping. There was a quiet strength in their actions that would have shamed the entire might of the 10th Legion. They were not conquering the world. They were healing it. And Lucius, the conqueror, felt himself to be the sickest and weakest of all in their presence. The chasm between his two lives reached its peak one night when Mary of Magdala spoke at the gathering. She wasn't preaching. She was simply telling her story. "Demons lived in me," she said softly, and the room was so quiet you could hear the crackle of the lamp's wick. Not just evil thoughts, darkness. It gnawed at me from the inside, whispering that I was filth, that I was unworthy to live. I was a broken vessel from which all hope had leaked out. People avoided me. I was dead long before my body was meant to die. Lucius looked at her, and it felt as though she were speaking about him. "And then he came," Mary continued, and her eyes glistened with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. "He looked at me, not with contempt, not with pity. He just saw me, all my pain, all my darkness, and he didn't flinch. He spoke but a word, and the darkness fled. He didn't ask if I deserved it. He just set me free. He gathered the broken pieces of my soul and made me whole. How can I not love him? How can I not follow him, even when it feels like the whole world is against us? He gave me life, not the one in the body, but real life." Her words were like a hammer blow to his own soul. But this blow did not kill. It shattered chains. All his lies, his mask of Quintus, all his fabricated sins. They all seemed petty and pathetic in the face of this overwhelming, transformative truth. He had pretended to be broken, but this woman had been truly broken and healed. Suddenly, the air in the room became thick, suffocating. The walls began to press in on him. The voices blurred into an indistinct hum. He saw their faces before him, trusting, compassionate. The faces of John, Peter, Barnabas, Mary. And he realized that his presence here, his lie, was a desecration of everything they believed in. He was a wolf pretending to be a lost sheep, and his fangs were about to break through. Panic seized him. He couldn't breathe. Abruptly, knocking over a cup of water, he jumped to his feet. All eyes in the room turned to him. "Quintus? What's wrong?" He heard John's concerned voice, but he couldn't answer, muttering something incoherent. He rushed to the door and stumbled out into the night's darkness. He leaned against the cold mud-brick wall, gasping for the cool air. He was trembling. 2 lives. He could no longer reconcile them. The mask was growing into his face, and he was afraid he would soon forget who he truly was. But who was he? Lucius, the murderer? Or Quintus, the seeker of forgiveness? Or perhaps he was both, and this contradiction was tearing him apart. He stood in the dark alley, alone with his terror. He knew he had to make a choice. Either leave forever and try to forget this quiet voice of hope, or return and tell the truth. A truth that would most likely cost him his life. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the hammer. Could such hands ever be clean? The night fell upon Lucius with all its weight. He stood with his back pressed against the rough wall, and every beat of his heart was a dull, panicked thud in his temples. He had fled, like a coward, like a raw recruit seeing the glint of an enemy sword for the first time. But the enemy wasn't outside. The enemy was inside, and his legions were memory, lies, and a relentless, soul-chilling shame. He looked at his hands in the dim light filtering through the clouds. The hands of a legionary, strong, calloused, accustomed to the hilt of a sword and the shaft of a pilum. Hands that had taken countless lives. He tried to clench them into fists, but his fingers wouldn't obey, trembling like autumn leaves in the wind. Could such hands ever be clean? The question wasn't rhetorical. It was the wall he had run into. Quiet footsteps behind him made him start. He spun around, his body instantly coiling for a fight, an instinct drilled into him by years of training. John emerged from the shadows. He stopped a few paces away, keeping his hands in sight as if to show he meant no threat. His face in the semi-darkness was serious and full of concern. "Quintus? What happened? Are you sick? We can help." The name Quintus struck Lucius like a slap. A lie? It was all a lie, and in that moment he knew he couldn't carry it any longer. He was tired of the fear, of the pretense of himself. The choice that had seemed impossible a moment ago now became the only one possible. The path back to the safe harbor of deceit was cut off. Ahead lay only a storm, but it was a storm of truth. "My name is not Quintus," Lucius breathed. The voice was alien, cracked. John froze. Confusion spread across his face. "What do you mean?" Lucius slowly straightened up, like an old man. He forced himself to look the disciple directly in the eye. The mask fell away. Standing before John was not a pathetic Samaritan, but who he truly was, a Roman soldier, a predator, a murderer. There was no more humility in his gaze, only an abyss of despair and self-loathing. "My name is Lucius Valerius Aquila." Each word was a stone he tore from his soul. "I am a legionary of the 10th Legion Fretensis. I serve in the Antonia fortress." He expected anything. A scream, horror, hatred. He saw John's face pale, saw fear flicker in his eyes. John instinctively took a step back. Anyone in his place would have called for help or run. A Roman soldier in their secret refuge was a death sentence for the entire community. "Why are you here?" John whispered, his voice trembling. "Were you sent?" "No." Lucius gave a bitter laugh. "No one sent me. I came on my own. I have been lying to you from the beginning. I am not a merchant. My sins are not dishonest dealings." He paused, gathering the last of his courage for the final, most terrible blow. He glanced down at his hands, then back up at John. "That day, on the hill," he began, his voice breaking. "On Golgotha, I was there. I was one of the 4. He saw the horror widen in John's eyes as he began to understand, and he finished, forcing the words out like poison. "It was I held the hammer." The silence that followed his words was deafening. It seemed as if the night city itself had fallen still. John stared at him, his gaze a mixture of terror, disgust, and something else Lucius couldn't decipher. He was seeing not just an enemy, not just a Roman occupier. He was seeing the man whose hands had driven nails through the hands of his teacher, his friend, his God. Lucius sank to his knees, not out of piety. His legs simply wouldn't hold him anymore. He fell into the road dust like a felled tree. All his soldiers' pride, all his Roman arrogance, crumbled to dust. He was broken. "I heard him," he rasped, staring at the ground. "He said, 'Forgive them.' He was asking for me, and I can't live with it. I came to find out what kind of power can forgive something like that. I deceived you, defiled your gathering with my presence. I am not asking for mercy. I know I deserve death. I just wanted you to know the truth." He fell silent, awaiting his sentence. A stone thrown at him. Curse. A knife's thrust. anything to end this torment. But instead of a blow, he heard a soft sound. He looked up. John was weeping. Tears rolled silently down his cheeks. But there was no hatred in his eyes. There was pain, a deep, devastating pain, and compassion. John slowly approached and knelt before Lucius. He reached out his hand, but not to strike. He placed his palm on the Roman's trembling shoulder. "For they know not what they do." John finished the phrase quietly, almost inaudibly. His voice was thick with tears. "He saw your heart then. He sees it now." Lucius shot him a bewildered, ravaged look. "But I knew what I was doing. I am a murderer." "You were blind, just like all of us," John replied, his hand tightening on Lucius's shoulder. "Peter denied him. Thomas doubted. We all ran away. Each of us killed him with our fear and our sin. Your hammer was only made of iron. Ours were made of disbelief. It was incomprehensible. It shattered the foundations of his world." The executioner and the victim's friend, kneeling before each other in the night dust. And the victim's friend was comforting the executioner. "Stand up, Lucius Valerius Aquila," John said, a new strength in his voice. "Your confession has been heard, but not by me. Come." "Where?" Lucius whispered. "To where you can be helped. You must tell this to Peter and the others." The thought of facing all of them, knowing who he was, brought a new wave of terror. But there was nowhere left to run. He slowly, painfully, got to his feet, leaning on John's arm. He felt empty, burned out. But in this emptiness, for the first time in many weeks, there was not the suffocating weight of a lie. He followed John back toward the house, toward the light shining from the window. He didn't know if he was walking to his judgment, his execution, or to the beginning of something more terrifying and more beautiful than anything he had ever known. He only knew one thing: his 2 lives were over. And now, tonight, one must begin. A real one. Every step back to the door was a step toward the gallows for Lucius. The air he had just been gasping for became heavy and thick again. He walked like a condemned man being led to his execution, not by a guard, but by a young fisherman whose compassion was more baffling and disturbing to him than any threat. He would have rather faced 10 furious zealots with daggers than what awaited him behind that door. When John pushed the door open and led him inside, the conversations in the room instantly died. A few people who had been preparing to leave froze in their tracks. All eyes turned to them, to John's pale but resolute face and to the figure of Lucius standing behind him like a shadow, broken, dirty, with the eyes of a cornered animal. Peter, standing in the center of the room, frowned. "John, what is happening? Quintus, are you unwell?" John scanned the small group that remained: Peter, his brother Andrew, Mary of Magdala, Barnabas, and a few other disciples. He took a deep breath. "His name is not Quintus," he said firmly. A whisper rustled through the room. Lucius felt a wave of fear and suspicion strike him. He forced himself to step out from behind John and into the light. "His name is Lucius Valerius Aquila. He is a soldier of the 10th Legion." In the dead silence that followed, a clay jug held by one of the women fell to the floor with a thud. Mary Magdalene's eyes widened in horror. Barnabas recoiled as if he had seen a ghost. But the most terrifying reaction was Peter's. The fisherman's face, which a moment ago had been concerned, transformed into an impenetrable mask of granite. His eyes narrowed, and his hands slowly clenched into fists. He took a step forward, his powerful frame radiating menace. "A spy," he growled. "The Sanhedrin sent you, or the Romans." "No," John intervened, stepping between Peter and Lucius. "Listen, he did not come as a spy. He came because he heard the teacher's words." "The teacher's words?" Peter's voice was full of venom. "What words does a Roman dog dare to speak in this house?" Lucius knew he had to speak for himself. He could no longer hide behind John. He stepped forward, meeting Peter's blazing, hate-filled eyes. "I do not ask you to listen to me," he said hoarsely. "I came for you to pass judgment on me." And then he repeated his confession, without tears, without excuses. In a dry, dead voice, he told them who he had been on that day at Golgotha. When he reached the words, "I held the hammer," Mary Magdalene let out a soft, stifled moan and covered her face with her hands. Andrew placed his hand on the hilt of the knife at his belt. But Peter exploded. With a roar like that of a wounded lion, he lunged at Lucius. He didn't reach for his knife. He grabbed the Roman by the rough fabric of his tunic and slammed him against the wall. The impact was so forceful that Lucius's vision went dark, and his head hit the mud-brick wall with a dull thud. "You!" Peter hissed, his face an inch from Lucius's, his eyes burning with rage and unbearable pain. "Your hands! Those cursed hands! They nailed him. I saw it. I saw the blood." Lucius did not resist. He went limp in the fisherman's powerful grip, accepting this fury as a deserved punishment. He deserved this. He deserved much more. "Peter, stop. In his name!" John shouted, trying to pull his friend away. Andrew and Barnabas rushed to help. The three of them struggled to tear the man, maddened by grief and rage, away from Lucius. The Roman slid down the wall to the floor. He lay in the dust, gasping for breath, not trying to get up. He closed his eyes, waiting for the next blow, which could be the last. "Kill him!" one of the disciples shouted. "He is a murderer. The law demands blood for blood." "He has defiled our house," another supported. The room buzzed with anger, fear, and pain. They were like a flock of sheep into which a wolf had strayed, and now that he was in their power, their shepherd's instinct demanded they tear him to pieces. But through this din, another voice broke through, quiet, trembling, but filled with undeniable authority. "Be still." It was Mary Magdalene. She lowered her hands from her face. Her cheeks were wet with tears, but her eyes were fixed on Peter. "Simon," she said, and there was steel in her voice. "Look at him." Peter, breathing heavily, broke free from his friend's grasp. He looked at Mary, then shifted his gaze to Lucius, crumpled on the floor. The rage still burned in his eyes, but something else was beginning to show through it. Confusion. "Look at him," Mary repeated more softly. "What do you see? A Roman soldier? Or the lost sheep the teacher spoke of?" "He is not a sheep. He is a wolf, the murderer of our Lord," Peter roared. "And you," Mary's voice struck like a whip. "Who were you in the high priest's courtyard when you said 3 times that you did not know him? Did your betrayal not drive a nail into his heart deeper than this man drove a nail into his hand?" Mary's words hung in the air. Peter froze as if struck by lightning. His face contorted. The rage subsided, giving way to the same crushing, all-consuming guilt he had carried within him since that terrible night. He remembered the rooster's crow, the look from Yeshua across the courtyard, his own bitter tears. He slowly turned and looked at Lucius, but now he saw not just a Roman. He saw a reflection of his own weakness, his own sin, his own despair. He saw a man drowning in the same abyss from which the teacher's hand had pulled him on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. A heavy, oppressive silence filled the room. Everyone was looking at Peter. The decision was his. He was the rock on which the teacher had promised to build his church. And now this rock had to either become a foundation for mercy or a tombstone for revenge. Peter took a deep, shuddering breath. He slowly walked over to Lucius, who was still on the floor. The Roman tensed, expecting the final blow. Instead, Peter knelt before him. There was no more hatred in his eyes, only a boundless, universal sorrow. He extended his rough, calloused hand. The hand of a fisherman, the hand of a betrayer, the hand that had been touched by forgiveness. "Stand up," he said in a muffled voice. His voice was barely audible, but in the silence, it sounded like thunder. "The teacher forgave you on the cross. Who are we to judge you now? Stand up, brother." The word brother did not ring out. It fell into the deafening silence of the room. For Lucius, it was like a clap of thunder in a clear sky. Impossible, incomprehensible, shattering. He had expected a curse, a stone, a knife. Instead, a hand was extended to him, and he was called brother. The legionary's brain refused to process this information. In his world, enemies were killed, traitors were executed, and murderers were not offered brotherhood. He stared at Peter's calloused hand, offered to him. He saw the dirt ingrained in the skin, the scars from fishing nets. It was the hand of a laborer, a man who knew pain and loss. Lucius hesitated. To touch that hand felt like sacrilege. His own fingers, which remembered the cold iron of the hammer, were unworthy of this contact. "Stand up," Peter repeated, softer but more insistent, and Lucius, obeying something greater than a command, placed his trembling hand in the fisherman's palm. Peter's grip was as strong as a rock. He lifted Lucius to his feet with no apparent effort. For a moment, they stood face to face. The Galilean fisherman and the Roman soldier, the executioner and the closest disciple, two broken men connected by an impossible forgiveness. Lucius couldn't meet Peter's gaze. He lowered his eyes, and for the first time in many years, a tear rolled down his unshaven cheek. A single one, hot as molten metal. The silence was broken by a quiet movement. Mary Magdalene approached them. Her face was pale, her eyes red from weeping, but there was no longer horror in them, only a deep, bottomless sorrow. She held a simple clay cup of water. Silently, she offered it to Lucius. He looked at her, then at the cup, and a memory pierced him. Another cup, a cup of sour wine that he, laughing with the other legionaries, had offered on a sponge to the parched lips of the man on the cross. It had been a mockery, an act of cruelty that deepened the humiliation. And now this woman, who had loved him more than life and had witnessed it all, was offering him, the murderer, a cup of clean water. It was not just an act of mercy. It was an answer. It was a refutation of his entire past, his entire life. His hands trembled so violently he was afraid he would drop the cup. He took it with both hands, feeling the coolness of the clay. He brought it to his lips and took a sip. The water was cold, and it burned his dry throat like fire. But it was a purifying fire. With each gulp, it seemed he was washing away not just his thirst, but also a part of the filth that coated his soul. When he lowered the cup from his lips, he saw that the gazes of the others in the room had changed. The fury was gone. Hostility had been replaced by a wary, bewildered sympathy. Andrew, Peter's brother, still had his hand on his knife, but his fingers were relaxed. Barnabas, the old man with kind eyes, looked at Lucius with such sorrow and pity it was almost unbearable. They didn't fully understand what was happening, but they trusted Peter, and they had seen what had happened with Mary. If these two, whose grief was the deepest, could take the first step, then they had to follow. "You need to leave before dawn," Peter said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, businesslike. "Go back to your fortress. Act as you normally would. No one must suspect anything. Your life is in more danger now than you can imagine. Not just from yours, but from ours. Not everyone will be able to understand this." Lucius nodded, unable to utter a word. What should I do?" he finally forced out. His old world had collapsed, and in the new one he had no map, no compass. Peter looked at John, then back at Lucius. "Wait, pray. Listen. You are no longer alone. We will find a way to contact you. For now, live. But live differently. Every morning when you put on your armor, remember that your heart no longer belongs to Rome." Peter placed a hand on Lucius's shoulder, this time as an equal. "Go in peace, brother Lucius." The last two words struck his heart again. Brother Lucius, not legionary Aquila, not the murderer, brother. He nodded silently, handed the empty cup to Mary, avoiding her gaze, and walked out the door without looking back. The night of Jerusalem greeted him with coolness and silence. He walked through the deserted streets toward the Antonia fortress, and the world around him seemed different. The stones under his feet, the stars overhead, the whisper of the wind. Everything was the same, but he himself had changed. He was still in rags, his face covered in dirt and stubble, and a bleeding wound gaped in his soul. But for the first time in many years he did not feel alone. The weight of his guilt had not disappeared. It was with him like his own shadow. But now, alongside that weight, something else had appeared, as fragile as a sprout pushing through stone. Hope. He had been forgiven, not because he deserved it, but because it had been granted to him. Freely, illogically, miraculously, he approached the walls of the fortress. The helmets of the sentries glinted in the torchlight. Soon he would have to put on that armor again, take up his sword. But now he knew he would be fighting a different war. Not for the glory of Rome or a legionary's pay, but to become worthy of the name he had been called in a small room full of his enemies. The name brother. This war promised to be the longest and hardest of his life. Slipping into the fortress unnoticed before the morning guard change was routine for Lucius. But this morning, everything was different. The air in the barracks, thick and stale, smelling of sweat, cheap wine, leather, and weapon grease, no longer felt like home. It hit his lungs like a foreign, poisonous substance. The snoring of his comrades, which used to be mere background noise, now sounded like the death rattles of men unaware of their spiritual demise. He sat on his bunk and, in the semi-darkness, began the ritual he had performed thousands of times, donning his armor. But now, every movement was filled with a new, agonizing meaning. The leather straps he tightened across his chest felt like bonds tying him to his past. The heavy segmented armor, the larica segmentata, which he draped over his shoulders, felt not like protection but like a sarcophagus. And when his fingers closed around the cold hilt of his gladius, he shuddered. This sword had shed so much blood. Now he felt defiled just by touching it. At the morning formation, he stood in rank like an automaton, following all of Centurion Cassius's commands. But his gaze was empty. He looked through the back of the soldier in front of him, through the fortress walls, through Jerusalem itself. He saw the faces in the small room. Peter's rage turning to anguish, Mary's tears filled not with hatred but with pain, John's quiet encouragement. Remember that your heart no longer belongs to Rome. Easy to say, but how does one live with such a heart in the body of a Roman soldier? The changes in him did not go unnoticed. He no longer participated in the cruel jokes played on new recruits. He stopped visiting the lupanar outside the fortress walls where legionaries found oblivion in the arms of slave girls. He didn't play dice, gambling away his meager pay. He became silent, but his silence was different than before. Previously, it had been the sullen alienation of a beast licking its wounds. Now it held a quiet, intense focus. "What's with you, Aquila?" Gaius, the same young man from Golgotha, asked him one day, finding him in a corner of the courtyard where Lucius was simply staring at the sky. "You've started acting like one of these Judean fanatics, always muttering to yourself and looking like you expect a ball of fire to fall from the sky." Lucius just looked at him, and there was so much weariness and sorrow in his gaze that Gaius shivered and walked away, muttering, "As you wish. Just watch out, Cassius won't like it. He thinks you've caught the local disease." Gaius was right. Centurion Cassius was watching him. A veteran who had been through fire and water, he could smell changes in his men like a wolf smells fear. He saw that one of his best, most hardened and ruthless soldiers was turning into something incomprehensible and, therefore, unreliable. The test came a week later. Lucius's patrol was called to disperse a spontaneous gathering near the Temple Mount. A zealot preacher was inciting the people to rebel against Rome. The crowd was small but agitated. Stones started to fly. One of them hit the helmet of the legionary next to Lucius. Cassius's order was short and clear. Clear the square. Use force. Before, this would have been a simple job for Lucius. A few blows with the butt of a pilum, a few shoves with a shield, and the crowd would have scattered. But now, looking into the faces filled with hatred and despair, he didn't see enemies. He saw people just as lost and suffering as he was. When a young man, almost a boy with burning eyes, raised a stone to throw at him, Lucius, instead of breaking his arm with a shield bash, did something he had never been taught in any legion. He just looked the youth in the eyes and said in broken Aramaic, "Don't. Go home. Your mother will weep." The young man froze in confusion. For a moment, the rage in his eyes was replaced by bewilderment. That hesitation was enough for other legionaries to push him back. But Cassius, watching the scene from his horse, saw everything. That evening he summoned Lucius. "What was that, Aquila?" he asked in an icy tone, not offering him a seat. "Mercy? Have you decided to become a philosopher?" "I carried out the order, Centurion." The square was cleared. Lucius answered evenly. "You did not carry it out as you should have. You showed weakness, and weakness is contagious. It's like a plague in a tight formation. One man falters and the whole century crumbles. I don't know what happened to you after that execution on the hill, but you need to burn it out of you. You are the hammer of Rome, not a shoulder for local women to cry on. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Centurion. I want to believe that." Cassius stepped closer, the scar on his cheek seeming to darken. "Because if I see it again, I will put you out of your misery. Myself. I will snap you like a rotten branch." Dismissed. Lucius left the centurion's tent, his heart pounding with cold fury and helplessness. He was trapped. Every action dictated by his new faith led him toward death. And every action dictated by his duty as a legionary was a betrayal of that faith. He wandered the fortress that night, feeling more alone than ever. Even the forgiveness granted to him now seemed distant and unreal. He was alone, in the heart of the enemy camp, his only companions fear and doubt. He sat by the parapet on the wall, looking out at the sleeping city. "Wait, pray, listen," Peter had told him. But how long could he wait? And then he saw it. On a sack of grain left against the wall, someone had clumsily drawn a simple sign in charcoal. 2 intersecting arcs, forming the silhouette of a fish. The sign was almost invisible in the shadow. Anyone else would have walked past. But Lucius stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. It was a message. The sign whispered about in the community. Ichthys. He was not alone. They remembered him. They were out there somewhere in the sleeping city, and they were thinking of their legionary brother. He reached out and carefully ran his fingers over the charcoal drawing. It wasn't tangible proof, not an escape plan. But in that moment, for Lucius, it was everything. It was an anchor thrown to him in a raging sea. It was a quiet whisper of hope in the darkness. The war within him was not over. But now he knew he had allies, and he could fight on. After wiping away the drawn fish with the edge of his sandal, Lucius felt something shift inside him. The sign was gone from the sackcloth, but it was imprinted on his mind. The desperate loneliness vanished, replaced by a tense anticipation. He was no longer just a repentant sinner passively awaiting his fate. He had become part of something larger, and that came with responsibility. Now, when he patrolled the streets or stood on the wall, he wasn't just serving his time. He was listening to snippets of conversations at the market, studying the faces of the temple guard, trying to catch the mood of the city. His ears, trained by years of service to recognize the sound of approaching cavalry or the clash of weapons, were now learning to recognize the whisper of fear, the rumble of discontent, the rumors of impending arrests. He had become an unwilling spy, but he was spying not for Rome, but against a darkness that, as he now understood, knew no nationality. Several days passed. The tension in Jerusalem grew. The apostles, emboldened, it was said, by the coming of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost, began to preach openly. Their boldness infuriated the chief priests, Annas and Caiaphas. Lucius heard officers in the fortress laughingly discuss how a handful of uneducated Galileans were confusing the minds of the entire city. But there was a nervousness beneath the laughter. Rome did not like it when someone confused minds. It always ended badly. Contact with the community came unexpectedly and simply. While supervising the delivery of supplies in the fortress courtyard, he noticed a skinny Jewish boy helping a carter haul sacks of barley. The boy was as inconspicuous as a sparrow in the road dust. As he passed Lucius, he stumbled and dropped a small object, roughly carved from olive wood. from his tunic. It was a fish. It fell right at the legionary's feet. The boy let out a frightened squeak, shot Lucius a quick, pleading look, snatched his toy, and, without raising his head, hurried after his master. It was not the boy, but it was the same sign. The next day, in the same place, Lucius saw him again. This time the boy was carrying water jugs. As he drew level with Lucius, without slowing his pace and looking straight ahead, he whispered just 2 words, "Gethsemane, midnight," and he walked on, disappearing into the bustle of the courtyard. The blood in Lucius's veins ran cold. Gethsemane, the garden where the teacher was arrested, a place of betrayal and fear. To go there at night alone was madness, could be a trap. Cassius could be testing him. Zealots could be waiting to ambush a hated Roman. All his instincts, all his training screamed, "Danger! Do not go!" But the quiet voice in his heart, the same one that had made him confess, whispered something else. "Listen," Peter had told him, this was not an order. It was a test, not of his loyalty, but of his faith. Slipping out of the Antonia fortress at night was nearly impossible. But Lucius knew it like the back of his hand. He knew about an old, almost garbage-clogged drain in the northern wall, through which a man without armor could crawl. He knew the sentry's blind spots. An hour before midnight, having changed into his simple tunic and thrown on a dark cloak, he moved like a shadow to the drain. Gritting his teeth in disgust, he crawled through the narrow, foul-smelling tunnel and emerged outside, at the foot of the fortress wall. The path to the Garden of Gethsemane led through the Kidron Valley, past ancient tombs that loomed dark in the moonlight. The air was cool and smelled of wormwood. The silence pressed on his ears. Finally, he entered the shade of the old olive trees. Their gnarled, twisted trunks looked like ghosts frozen in silent prayer. Everything here screamed of that night. He could almost physically feel the disciples' fear, the teacher's resolve, the cold metal in the hands of the guards. He waited, hidden in the shadow of the largest tree. Time dragged on. Doubts began to gnaw at him again. What if it was a mistake? What if he had imagined it all? "Peace be with you, Lucius." He spun around, his hand darting to his belt where his dagger usually hung. A man emerged from behind a neighboring tree. It was not Peter or John. It was Barnabas, the old man with kind and weary eyes. He was alone. At the sight of him, Lucius felt immense relief. Barnabas inspired no fear. He exuded a calm and a kind of solid, earthy wisdom. "You took a risk coming here," Barnabas said, stepping closer. "You risked no less by trusting me," Lucius replied. "Faith always involves risk." The old man smiled gently. "We called you because we need help, not as a soldier but as a brother. The city is restless. The Sanhedrin is furious that Peter and John healed the lame man at the beautiful gate of the temple and are preaching the resurrection. They have already been arrested once but were released for fear of the people. But they will not rest." Barnabas paused, looking into Lucius's face. "We are not asking you to betray Rome or take up a sword for us. The teacher forbade us that. But you are our eyes and ears where we are blind and deaf. In the fortress, you hear what we do not. The talk of officers, orders, reports. We need to know if the Sanhedrin asks the prefect for help. If they decide to finish us once and for all using Roman swords." Lucius understood. He had been placed on the most dangerous post, between the hammer and the anvil. "There is one man," Barnabas continued, lowering his voice. "His name is Stephen. He is not one of the 12, but he is filled with the Spirit and wisdom. He speaks in such a way that no one can stand against him in an argument. And he has drawn the special hatred of the elders upon himself. They are seeking false witnesses to accuse him of blasphemy against Moses and against God. That is a certain death. And they cannot stone him without the consent of your procurator." The old man placed his wrinkled hand on Lucius's forearm. His touch was surprisingly strong. "If you hear his name, Stephen, within the fortress walls, if you hear that an arrest involving legionaries is being prepared, let us know. By any means, through the same boy, could save his life." Lucius looked into the old man's serious, pleading eyes. He had come here to find salvation for his soul, and now he was being asked to help save someone else's life. It was not an order. It was a request, and by accepting it, he would definitively cross the line. He would become a traitor in the eyes of Rome, and an accomplice in the eyes of God. "I have heard you, Barnabas," he said firmly. "I will listen." He did not swear an oath. He spoke no grand words. But in the silence of the Garden of Gethsemane, on the very spot where his new life had begun with another's betrayal, Lucius Valerius Aquila made his choice. He accepted his first commission. He became a guardian for his former enemies. Back in the fortress, Lucius became a hunter. But his prey was not an enemy on the battlefield, but an elusive whisper, a fragment of a phrase, a fleeting glance. He turned the barracks, the training ground, and even the latrines into his hunting grounds. Every day he calibrated his senses, learning to filter out the usual soldierly chatter about wine, women, and pay from something significant. He was a shadow, gliding along the edge of others' conversations, his face an impenetrable mask of indifference, but his ears burned, absorbing every word. Days turned into weeks. The name Stephen was not mentioned. Lucius began to have doubts. Perhaps Barnabas had exaggerated the danger? Perhaps the Sanhedrin had decided to leave this bold preacher alone? This silence was more torturous than an open threat. It was lulling, causing him to lose his vigilance. Several times he caught his mind wandering and furiously brought himself back to his mission. He had no right to relax. A man's life depended on his attention. Confirmation came from where he least expected it, from Centurion Cassius. One afternoon, Lucius was cleaning his scutum in the courtyard when he saw Cassius talking to a man in rich robes. Lucius recognized him as one of the captains of the temple guard, a man named Malchus, the same one whose ear, according to rumor, Peter had cut off with a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane. The captain looked agitated and annoyed. They were speaking in Greek, a language Lucius knew well enough. He continued to methodically scrape his shield, trying to look completely absorbed in his work, but his entire being had turned into an ear. "He is sowing discord right at the foot of the temple," Malchus fumed. "He perverts the law of Moses, says that this Nazarene of theirs will destroy the holy place." The people listened to him. Cassius, the common folk, women, even some Levites. Cassius listened with barely concealed contempt. "Your religious disputes do not concern me, Malchus. As long as they pay their taxes and don't throw stones at my soldiers, they can worship a talking donkey for all I care." "This is more than a dispute," the captain insisted. "This man, Stephen, he is the spark that could ignite the whole city. The Sanhedrin has found witnesses. We are ready to hold a trial, but we fear a riot. His supporters might try to rescue him." There it was. The name. Lucius's heart skipped a beat, but his hands did not falter, continuing their monotonous movement. Cassius lazily scratched the scar on his cheek. "And what do you want from me? For my legionaries to become bodyguards for your priests? Pilate will not approve. He believes you should handle your own heretics." "We don't need your legionaries for the trial," Malchus said hastily, lowering his voice. "We need them to be nearby, patrol at the gates, reinforcements on the walls of the Antonia, just to show force, to cool hot heads. If the people see that Rome will not intervene on the side of this blasphemer, they will calm down. We will do everything quickly, according to our law." Cassius thought for a moment, looking out at the city beyond the fortress walls. "A noisy business," he finally said. "But if you do everything very quickly, and I don't have to write a report to the prefect about disturbances, perhaps on the day of the trial, my men will have more business in the eastern part of the city. Far from your gates." Malchus beamed. He bowed, obsequiously thanking the centurion, and hurried away. Cassius watched him go with a long, contemptuous look, then turned and met Lucius's eyes. For a split second, their gazes locked. Lucius hadn't had time to look away. There was no suspicion in the centurion's eyes, only a cynical, weary understanding, like a master looking at his dog that has witnessed something dirty but is incapable of understanding it. Cassius grunted and walked away, but Lucius understood everything. He knew what it meant. Rome was washing its hands of it. They were giving the Sanhedrin the green light. They would let them kill Stephen, as long as the city remained quiet. A cold sweat broke out on him under his armor. He now had more than just information. He held a death sentence, and he was the only one who could try to delay it. The next day was torture. He waited for the messenger boy to appear, but the supply wagon never came. Panic began to flood him. What if he was too late? What if the trial had already begun? Every shout from the street, every sound of a horn seemed to him the beginning of the massacre. He had to act himself. The risk was monstrous, but inaction was tantamount to complicity in murder. That evening, after being dismissed, he did not go to the barracks. Changing into his tunic, he headed into the city. He didn't go to the house by the pool, that would be too dangerous. He went to the market, into the thickest part of the crowd, hoping to blend in. He looked for a familiar face, any face, but he saw only strangers in different people. Despair began to grip him, and then he saw her. One of the women who served in the community, her name was Susanna. She was buying olives from a merchant. He slowly, trying not to attract attention, began to approach. He walked past her, almost brushing her shoulder, and without looking at her, whispered one word, "Stephen." The woman flinched as if struck, but did not turn around. She dropped a few coins, and while she was picking them up, Lucius had already disappeared into the crowd, heading in the opposite direction. He didn't know if she had understood. He didn't know if his message would get through. He had done all he could. Returning to the fortress, he felt empty. He had crossed the line. He had committed treason. He had put his life on the line for a man he had never seen. The war within was over. The war without had begun, and he was on the front line, alone in the armor of his enemy. The warning had been passed, but the world did not change. On the contrary, the air in Jerusalem grew even thicker and more electric. Lucius learned that his message had been received. Irritation crept into the legionaries' conversations that the Nazarenes' followers had become even more cautious, their gatherings even more secret. Stephen, however, did not go into hiding. Defying all logic, he continued to preach in the synagogues, his voice ringing out even louder, even bolder. Lucius couldn't understand it. Why walk willingly to certain death? But then he would remember the face on the cross, and a cold, sharp realization would pierce him. Perhaps for these people, there were things more important than preserving their own lives. The end came suddenly. In the morning, his century was called to arms. Cassius's order was brief: secure a perimeter at the Damascus gate. The Sanhedrin had passed sentence on a blasphemer, and the crowd was leading him to his execution. Officially, Rome was not involved. Unofficially, the legionaries were to ensure that this act of popular anger did not escalate into a full-scale riot. "Just stand and watch," Cassius told his soldiers. "Let them deal with their own filth." Lucius's heart sank. He understood everything. This was the day of judgment Malchus had spoken of. The sun was at its zenith when they arrived. A crowd had already gathered outside the city gates. This was not the silent, sorrowful crowd that had stood on Golgotha. This was a roaring, frenzied mob, their faces contorted with hatred. They were dragging a man in torn clothes. His face was beaten, but his eyes burned with an otherworldly light. It was Stephen. Lucius stood in rank, clutching his pilum. His armor grew hot in the sun, but the cold inside him was icy. He was here to guard murderers. His hands, which had held the hammer, now held a spear, ensuring order for the carrying out of yet another unjust execution. The circle had closed, and he was once again an executioner, albeit a passive one. The crowd dragged Stephen into a rocky hollow. Leading the way, with a fanatical gleam in his eyes, was a young man from Tarsus named Saul. He did not throw stones himself, but he fervently approved of the proceedings, gathering the outer garments of those who prepared for the killing. "Blasphemer!" the crowd roared. "Our law demands his death." The first stone, the size of a fist, struck Stephen in the shoulder. He staggered but remained standing. Then a hail of stones rained down on him. Lucius watched with a detached horror. He had seen death in battle, brutal and bloody. But this was different. This was not a fight, but a lynching. An unarmed man was being stoned to death by a mob drunk on its own righteousness. Stephen fell to his knees, covering his head with his hands. Blood streamed down his face, mixing with the dust. Lucius felt nausea rising in his throat. He had to do something, intervene, shout, but he was bound. By orders, by discipline, and by fear. He was one of them, a cog in the machine ensuring this murder. And then, through the roar of the crowd, he heard Stephen's voice. He lowered his hands and lifted his bloodied face to the sky. There was no fear or hatred in his gaze, only light and a kind of unearthly sorrow. "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit," he cried out. And then, as another stone struck his forehead and he began to fall, he whispered the words that shattered Lucius's world for the second and final time. "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." It was an echo of the voice from the cross, the same impossible, divine mercy, forgiveness granted at the moment of supreme suffering to his murderers. In that instant, Lucius understood everything. He understood why Stephen had not fled. He understood the power that moved these people. It wasn't just faith in a risen teacher. It was a life lived by his example. A life that was stronger than death. Something inside Lucius broke. It didn't just crack. It shattered into 1,000 pieces. The wall of cynicism, the wall of discipline, the wall of fear, it all came crashing down. He looked at Stephen's body lying in the dust, at the roaring crowd, at the young Saul whose face expressed cold satisfaction, at the impassive face of Cassius watching from his horse. And he knew he could no longer be a part of this. Not for another minute. His hands relaxed. The heavy ashwood pilum fell to the stony ground with a clatter. Then he took off his Gallia helmet and dropped it beside the spear. The clang of metal sounded louder in his ears than the shouts of the crowd. A few legionaries standing nearby stared at him in amazement. Gaius, on his right, hissed, "Lucius, are you mad? Pick it up." But Lucius wasn't listening. He took a step out of the formation, then another. Slowly, as if in a dream, he turned his back on the execution site, on his comrades, on his centurion, and walked away. He wasn't running. He was simply leaving. "Aquila!" A voice like ice and fury roared from behind him. It was Cassius. "Back in rank. That's an order." Lucius did not turn back. He kept walking, looking straight ahead at the city walls. "Aquila, I'll kill you for this. You are a deserter." He knew it was true. He was a deserter. He had betrayed his oath, his legion, his Rome. He had lost everything, his name, his service, his past. He was walking into nothing, unarmed, defenseless, without a future. But for the first time since that day on Golgotha, he felt free. The guilt for the hundreds he had executed had not vanished. But now he knew how to live with it. Not by hiding, but by atoning. He would no longer take up arms to take a life. His hands, which once held a hammer, had to learn to do something else. To heal, to help, to serve. He did not know what awaited him around the bend. Perhaps a crossbow bolt in the back from Cassius. Perhaps arrest and crucifixion, this time his own. Or perhaps a new life. The life of Brother Lucius. But whatever awaited him, he walked toward his destiny with his head held high, and in his ears rang not the centurion's threats, but the last words of the man who had died in the dust outside the city gates. Words of forgiveness. The shouts of Cassius behind him faded, replaced by stunned silence. Then a short, sharp command that Lucius no longer heard. He didn't look back. Every step took him further from 12 years of service, from iron discipline, from the only life he had ever known. He had crossed an invisible line, and the bridge behind him had burst into flames. He did not head for the secret house by the pool. That would have been too dangerous for both him and the community. He disappeared into the labyrinth of the lower city's narrow streets, moving instinctively, like a wounded animal seeking shelter. His mind was empty. The shock of his actions had pushed out all thoughts, leaving only a ringing silence in which two voices, merged into one, echoed, "Forgive them! Do not hold this sin against them." By evening, as the city began to sink into twilight, he found refuge in an abandoned tomb on a hillside, smelling of the dust of ages and dampness. He spent the night here, shivering not so much from the cold as from the realization of what had happened. He was an outlaw, a deserter. To Rome he was a dead man. His name would be struck from the rolls, his pay confiscated, and any legionary had the right to kill him on sight. But with the fear came a strange, almost intoxicating sense of lightness. By shedding his armor, he seemed to have shed the weight of his former self. He was no longer Lucius Aquila the executioner. Who he was now he did not know. Just Lucius, a man searching for a path. He hid for several days, eating what he could find or beg for, living among the beggars and lepers, those his former world considered scum. He learned to be invisible, learned a humility he had never possessed. He listened to their stories, full of pain and injustice, and for the first time in his life he felt no contempt or detachment. He felt compassion. He was one of them. Stephen's execution marked the beginning of a brutal persecution. Saul of Tarsus, with the Sanhedrin's approval, breathed threats and murder, bursting into homes, seizing men and women and throwing them into prisons. The community scattered. Many fled Jerusalem for Judea and Samaria. Lucius heard about this in frightened whispers on the streets. He realized that finding his brothers in the city would be impossible. His path lay away from Jerusalem. But where? One night, sharing a flatbread by a fire with a toothless old man, he heard a name, Antioch, the great city to the north in Syria. It was said that many of the way had fled there, and there, among the Gentiles, they had found an unexpected refuge. Antioch was beyond the Sanhedrin's authority, and the Roman governor cared little for the disputes of Jewish sects. Antioch. The word became a beacon for him. The journey was long and dangerous. Without money, without weapons, in nothing but a tunic. But he went. He walked, joining caravans, working for food and lodging. His hands, accustomed to the sword, learned other work, carrying bales, cleaning stables, mending nets. Every evening, rubbing his calluses, he felt not humiliation, but purification. This pain was honest. It did not bring death, but sustained life. Several months later, exhausted, tanned black by the sun, his hair bleached, he entered the gates of Antioch. The city overwhelmed him with its noise, its multilingualism, its diversity. Here, Greeks, Romans, Syrians, Jews, all were mixed in one boiling pot. He searched for a long time, listening, looking, until one day in the port district, he saw a familiar, hastily scratched sign on a warehouse wall. A fish. He had found them. They received him with caution, but when he gave his name and told his story, they recognized him. The news of the Roman soldier who had thrown down his weapons at Stephen's execution site had become a legend and had reached Antioch before him. He was met by Barnabas, who had also fled Jerusalem. The old man embraced him, tears in his eyes. "Welcome home, brother Lucius." It was the end of one journey and the beginning of another. He did not become a preacher or a teacher. His past was too heavy for that. He found his ministry elsewhere. He became a healer, using knowledge of herbs learned in the legion and the steadiness of hands trained by weapons. He treated wounds, set dislocated joints, and cared for the sick in the poor quarters of the city. His hands, which had once driven nails, now applied bandages. His voice, which had given orders for executions, now comforted the suffering. He never forgot his past. Every face, every life taken, remained with him like scars on his soul. The guilt did not disappear, but it ceased to be a destructive force. It became fuel for his service, an eternal reminder of the abyss from which he had been pulled, and of the price that had been paid. Sometimes, looking at his hands, he could still see the shadow of the hammer. But then he would also see the outstretched hand of Peter, the cup of water in Mary's hands, and the kind eyes of Barnabas. He was part of a new legion, a legion of healed healers of forgiven sinners, led not by the eagle of Rome, but by the quiet voice that had once spoken on a hill outside the walls of Jerusalem. And in this service, in this new battle for life instead of death, Lucius Valerius Aquila, the former executioner, finally found his salvation.